So welcome to another Behind the Theme. Today we're talking about Liberté. Now Liberté is a board game about the French Revolution. And what I want to do is show in Behind the Theme how the board game really takes into account a lot of historical facts. And I will be giving these historical facts from its gameplay and its mechanics. So let's get into it. Now first let's give a background of the French Revolution. It basically came about due to the successive problems that had come into the French state all the way since the excessive spending of Louis XIV, leading up to the excessive wars and spending of Louis XV, and of course the excessive spending of Louis XVI. Louis XVI obviously being bankrupted when he supports, strangely, the American Revolution, and with money he already didn't have, and of course with inclusive with famines and all, this led to several problems which in the end even Louis XVI had to call in the Estates General. The Estates General basically brings in the three estates of the state, which is the nobility, the clergy, and everybody else, to come to a consensus to try to solve the financial woes and the social woes of the state of France. Of course, this doesn't work out, and just to let you know why it didn't work out, you have to think about it. The nobility and the clergy added up to about 3% of the entire population of France. The third estate consists of 97%, but yet, if you notice the math, the first two estates, the nobility and the clergy, could always outvote the third estate, which was everybody else. Naturally, the third estate was not happy. At one point, they were locked out, and then being thoroughly angered, they went over to a tennis court, or rather, at the time, it could have been a handball court, and formed, of course, the ideals of liberté, equalité, fraternité. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now we will see how the board game really brings in the historical facts into the gameplay of Liberté. Now, the first thing I'd like to talk about is the whole semblance of war in Liberté. Now, this is really thematic because what happened was, in the history, France, alright, did not wait for the other powers to declare war on them. They in fact declared war, and thinking that it's better to attack first than wait to be attacked, they declared war on Austria. Then after that there was some setbacks, and so then after that Prussia came into the fold. And then as things went on, France declared war on Spain and basically every other major power in Europe. So how does this come in through the board? There is a battle box, which is basically an abstracted way of dealing with all the several fronts that France was fighting in. And what you do is, instead of allocating support politically onto France itself, you put troops, or rather your support, into the army. This is really thematic. Why? Because what happens is you have to take into consideration that all the battles were basically royalist support. All the armies coming in were to put Louis XVI, or rather a king, back onto the throne of France. So if you ignore, if let's say all the players ignore all these battles, what happens is suddenly it makes it much easier for the royalists to win, because naturally if there are enemy armies marching into France, you're not only losing territorial control, you're losing support, because the people will see that the Republic can't protect itself. And this is shown in the way mechanically, whereby for each of the battles that are not won by the French Republic, that's basically a victory point that makes it easier for the royalists to win the game as a sudden death kind of victory. On top of that, you got the situation where you need a general to command it. The problem, of course, with generals at the time is that many of the generals were from nobility, and when any general got in fact too powerful, many people in the government were so afraid of someone with military power like Caesar taking over that they would basically guillotine them. So this is also very thematic in the game, because many times when you put down a general, you don't want a person to win the battle box because he gets several victory points. And so what you do is that you wait to play cards to kill his generals. So each of you are killing each other's generals, even though for France you want those generals to win the battles, to keep France a republic. It's extremely thematic. It feels that way when you're playing it. You know, you're always winning when, oh, that general is getting too powerful. I can't give him that many victory points, so I'm going to kill that general. Just like basically what the National Assembly and all were doing to their own generals in the state of France. The next thing I would like to talk about is the side of the board, which is the track that involves three factions that are in the game. Well, not, and you don't play the faction. You play someone who's trying to manipulate all three sides and basically get through the French Revolution in the best form. Now, the first one is of course the Royalists, which are basically acting, as you notice, behind the scenes in the game. You know, you're waiting to win battles in outside of France, and you're quietly just hoping the situation where the other two, the moderates, which is the Girondins, and the radicals, which are the Jacobites, fight each other hard enough that you can slowly grab certain provinces which royalists support in France, and then along with the victory points from the battles, win a sudden death victory. Whereas when you got the radicals, or rather the Jacobins, which was named after the debating club which many of these revolutionary leaders came from, of which this debating club was named after the monastery whereby they used to gather to discuss matters of revolution. Again, very interesting. And then there are the moderates, or the Girondins. Now these were the people that were fighting basically in the National Assembly for control of the Republic of France. Because here's the strange part. The royalists were basically out of it for the most part, because they were being killed most of the time. And they knew to keep their heads down if they wanted to stay alive. Now the Girondins and the Jacobins, what they did was they both wanted a republic. But here's the strange part. One didn't want to kill the king, that's why they're moderates. They saw the value of keeping Louis around, because then at least the other warring factions like, you know, Austria and all might not pose, it wouldn't be such a radical change that everybody would hate them to a certain extent. So that's why they're called moderates. Whereas the Jacobins basically just wanted a total change. It was republic, no king, forever, and they would take it to any extreme. Which of course the moderates saw as way too dangerous, and therefore the two of them were naturally, those two groups were always fighting inside the assembly. And to show how much more radical and how far that they were willing to take it, is if in the game the radicals or the Jacobins win at any one of the elections, they have more than the allotted amount of support in the assembly, they win an outright victory. Alright? So what you try to do as the moderates and the royalists is also to pull back, to make sure that, because the cards do favor the Jacobins in later parts of the game, but what you want to do is, you know this, but so what you want to do is just hold them down. You know, you want to, as a moderate or royalist, just make sure that they don't get too much support, while at the same time trying to push your agenda. So again, you can see how, just like in the real history, each of the factions in Liberté, the board game, really brings in this feel like you are constantly thinking how to play each side against each other, be it the royalists against the Jacobins versus the moderates, and so on. Now we will go to the cards of Liberté. Now the first thing is, you turn to the back of the card, you see that there is the tricolor, the flag of France. Now, interesting history behind this. The way the tricolor came about was, firstly, the red and blue is the color of Paris. And then when, of course, the revolution came about, they divided the colors of Paris with the white, which what the white represent? The House of Bourbon. So if you put that together, it simply states that Paris was divided by the House of Bourbon. So that's how the tricolor came about, and it became the national flag of France. Now, the first card I would like to talk about is, of course, to me, one of the most interesting cards in terms of history, is about the Sans Collect. Now, the Sans Collect card allows you to take one more person in your tableau of characters in the game. Now, this is actually very true also in the history, because what happened was, to this day, France is extremely centralized into Paris. And the Sans Collect were basically depending on which history you read, they either were the urban working poor, or inclusive of basically artisans. And also whether you call them urban poor is debatable, but basically they were the working class of France. Alright, and what happens is, the nobility and all wore the collet, which were knee breeches. They didn't wear the collat, which then they called themselves the Sans Collect. And so what happened was, all this radical support of these massive amount of people in Paris led to the National Assembly having to listen to them, because they were literally at one point even broke into National Assembly to push their agenda. So you can see how this is represented in the game, whereby if you have Sans Collect support, you get more people that will join your cause, meaning that you have more people in your tableau. Again, it comes out of the game very much so you feel like you got more support because now you have one more person to put down. The other part is that comes out is bread shortage. The card bread shortage, in the history of it, what happened was, of course, there were successive famines, and to give some statistic on the population rise of France, in the last 2 centuries before the French Revolution, the French population rose by about 1 million. In the 18th century alone, that the French Revolution was in, France's population went from 20 million to 26 million. So they had rose by 6 times more than the last 2 centuries. And so this extreme population growth, coupled with famines and the country being in debt, meant that there was always severe bread shortages and people were starving. In fact, just before the French Revolution, bread became so scarce, and due to people profiteering and hoarding, that the price of a loaf of bread could equate to a person's monthly wage, which, as you can see, leads to the effects that the card in the game shows, which is you can take certain support out. Now, the next thing is, of course, one of the most famous things the French Revolution brought about, which was the guillotine. The guillotine was, of course, brought about by Joseph Guillotin, and it was named by Marat, or in his radical newspaper. And the guillotine was an idea which very much fit in, to be absolutely honest, with the whole ideals of égalité, or equality, because before, only nobility got killed by decapitation. The rest of the ways that people died were horrible and pretty much took a long time to die, be it hanging and all that. So what happened was Guillotin felt that not only nobility should be killed in such a way, basically fast, even the poor. So he invented the guillotine, which on top of that made it very, very effective, because with the counterweight and everything, it was always very quick, and as he would say, painless, although we have never had a person come back and tell us, but for the most part, if you see it, it's pretty quick. So a egalitarian way of dying. And the way that the game kind of really shows this sense of finality, should we say, is really cool, because what happens when you remove a person from the game by other cards, you put them back into the discard, then you shuffle them again. When you guillotine a person in the game, he's put out of the game. That means the card will never come back. And if you were card counting, it affects the amount of times that even if there was a reshuffle there, you're going to get this number of cards for this faction, because this leader or this person supporting this faction has died. Now then there's the terror card. The sad part of the terror in French Revolution was that there was not only one terror, there was a terror, and then there was the Great Terror. It got so bad that if someone or the secret police or even your neighbor heard you even saying something along the lines of using the old greetings such as Monsieur or Madame, instead of the more politically correct one of citoyen or citizen, you could literally be carted off to die. You know, or you put into one of the prisons, which basically equated to death. And so the terror was this horrible situation where people were being killed left and right. In fact, it became so bad that in Paris, about 800 people died a day in the Great Terror, which was when it was at its worst. In fact, the terror card, when it is played, is very thematic, because firstly, the first prerequisite is you need Jacobin support in that area. Alright, and if you have radical support, then they can remove the entire other faction that of their choice, be it moderate, royalist, and so on. In fact, in an even more thematic way, radical can remove radical, because, and as it happened, you know, with Danton and Robespierre, it was not uncommon for radicals to fall upon another faction of radicals. And on top of that, you get to remove and guillotine a person's, or even your own faction's, one of the people on your tableau. And so that is how Liberté, the board game, really brings out the whole French Revolution in terms of the political aspect. And of course, you see that how, also like I explained before, how from this French Revolution and of course the old monarchy, that France became extremely, to this day, a very centralized state. In fact, you know, to this day, France uses French as the main language because the French Revolution even imposed language issues, which was no longer were people allowed to speak Catalan or Breton, and so on. They all had to use French. Of course, this took a period of time, but it all led to this situation of centralization from Paris. The rules came from Paris, it spreads out. So that is behind the theme. Next time we'll be talking about behind the theme, some of the characters of the French Revolution in Liberté. So thank you very much. Till next word.